So because Martin has already so well summed up the discussions yesterday, and I think you've all been present to the discussions today, I will just try to pick up some general ideas from both days. And also because we intend to organize the panel after this immediately as a public conversation, so it won't be us telling you immediately what we think, but we really want you to come and talk to us. So we think that a lot of interesting points will come up as a public talk. So I will just give you some ideas maybe that you want to think about. So I would say that we've seen two kinds of positions from the speakers these 2 days. We've seen individual positions, and that was mostly artists. And then we've seen institutional positions, and that meant people affiliated with institutions, running them, having founded them, or representing them in one way or another. And I couldn't help but notice that there was quite an important difference between these two types of positions. I would say that the artistic positions seemed to play with the freedom of being poetic, of being ironic, of making mistakes, of not being right all the time. And on the other hand, institutional positions were very much concerned with being right and being the good guys. I think one of the issues that we should address is whether these two positions, I mean, how do they collide? And whether in the case of the institutional positions, we can speak of various levels of complicity, compromise, and in what sense. We have seen, well, non-Western curators working in non-Western institutions. We've seen non-Western curators working in Western institutions. We've seen Western curators working in Western institutions. We've seen the whole spectrum. And we've heard of many types of negotiations. We've had most of them giving us their position both in a, shall we say, enthusiastic way, but also in a kind of apologetic way. So trying to justify, trying to explain, trying to say why they're doing the right thing. Most of them also raise the question of how they are legitimated via Western institutions, and I think it's something we should address. And Marina Fokidis also spoke about counter-discourse to hegemony that eventually becomes hegemony, and I don't think that was addressed at any point. It kind of stayed in the air. And right after that, we had this question of big events and big institutions, Documenta or Basel or all of these, and whether they are or they are not the same thing. And I don't think it's something that was actually addressed, because there were artists who felt they deserve to be in them finally, that they are proud to be in them. Others who think they are somehow using them, but I've actually not once heard the term subversion. It's probably out of fashion or something. And others want these kind of institutions gone because they're instances of the old power. So this is just for you to think of. Just very close to that, there's the question of terminology. I think everyone was asking, as it is perhaps of use in this kind of conferences, whether we should redefine old terms or invent new ones, and what does that mean for history, whether we want to participate in Western history. And I especially liked Amarildo Ajas's intervention. He was not a speaker, but he was in the public, who asked whether we should only rewrite art history from a post or a decolonial position. So it feels like we've had a kind of monoculture discourse throughout the conference, and we never really looked outside of that. And this brings me to the question of geography. first of all, I should say that most speakers, made the point that this transnational exchange is already happening. There's new models and so on and so forth. And from a historical perspective, we're already far from, the kind of diplomatic exchanges that were going on in the 90s that were kind of forcing connections between cultures, and they were kind of uncritical and forced. But now, I could, if I were to, I thought that if I had dropped in on this conference without really knowing what it was about, I would have thought there's maybe a kind of new world order, because the regions that were mostly talked about were of course Western Europe, and I mean Germany, Austria, France, and maybe the UK, although there are other countries in Western Europe. And then there's Asia, and specifically Southeast Asia. And then there's Africa, the northern and the central part. I've not heard mention of, for example, South Africa, Russia, China, South America, Central America, or for that matter, Eastern Europe. So it seems like there's a kind of large part of the globe that is not part of this global transnational exchange. So I'm wondering if the models and the paradigms that we're proposing are actually available, and they ring true in all of these contexts. I think that it's, Western Europe is definitely at the center of this new world order that we're discussing. It's not left the center, and I don't think that any of the interventions took it off that pedestal. Then there's Asia that has specifically a positive image throughout, and then there's Africa, about which we all know we were wrong. But then many other regions, for example, I can think of Russia and China, that are much more problematic and that we don't know whether we should be good about or bad about. They've also not been discussed. So I'm wondering if perhaps in the audience there are people who might have opinions or positions about that. And I also caught up on something that interests me, and I think could be a nice footnote on this non-aligned movement, whether it was mentioned several times, discussed either as a dictators club or this alternative network for production that we kind of also need to unearth. So maybe there's also something that people have thoughts about. And to kind of bring it back to the first question and to sort of sum up these thoughts, I would say that this art world versus world question kind of pops up. And I don't think it needs an explanation or an introduction, but I would like to connect it specifically to what I said at the beginning, whether this relationship between art world and world becomes effective on the level of the individual work or practice, or on the level of institutions. So that's my summary of these 2 days. I don't know if you agree with it, but I think it would be now interesting to have a discussion, and not just about these thoughts, but about almost everything that we've said. Yes?
I just have a question. Why do you think Chinese and Russian context is quote-unquote problematic? Because if you just throw that and we don't talk about it, it just adds to this understanding that somehow the Chinese and the Russian world is quote-unquote problematic. So I think it's good to maybe open it up and see what you mean and maybe what other people mean by that.
But can we perhaps already do this panel thing? So maybe there's something more interesting than just me answering.